land developments. You had the Bunnell land development, which had 30,000 acres, hot to sell you. You had another land developer out in western Flagler. They had another 30,000 acres plus, and they were hot to sell you land. And the only way you could get to them was by steamboat, coming down to the Bull Creek Fish Camp, where we're going to have a wonderful lunch. The steamboats don't run anymore, but I'll tell you, if they did, I'd be their first customer. Because you could get on board a steamboat in, let's say, Jacksonville, and come down on the river, and you'd end up at Dead Lake at what they call the Bull Creek Fish Camp, where we're going, on an overnight steamboat trip. And these were big steamboats, and they'd be fun. I think people 100 years ago had a lot more fun than they do today. I guess you could move me back then. I don't like the clothing though. Dry cleaning hadn't been invented. And it wasn't that great, the stuff that you had to wear. Okay, now this is US 1. On your right is Henry Flagler's railroad, the Florida East Coast. And of course, I know you all know that Henry once ran this thing all the way down to Key West. Everybody said he was mad as a hatter to do it, but nevertheless he did. He built this railroad down to Key West. This is still a very active railroad, and it runs freight from Miami north, and is a very, very in-use railway called the Florida East Coast. Now, we're coming up on a big pile of junkyards. You're going to see junkyards everywhere. This was once an immense rail center. This was once called DuPont, and the farmers had little Tunerville trolley narrow gauge railroads that ran all across Flagler County to get their goods to market. In some cases, the cars were driven by mules. They were mule-pulled cars. They didn't even have steam engines. But when Henry Flagler showed up with his fancy regular railroad, he purchased a lot of these narrow gauge railroads and merged them into his regular gauge railroad. Now, we're coming by DuPont right now. DuPont right here, right now, with all these junkyards, was an immense center. There were hotels here. There were houses. There were stores. There were people that lived here. This was a small city. Does any of it exist? Not a shred. There's nothing of it left. There's no record it was even here. I've got pictures of it in my book here. But this was an immense rail center on your right. And people would come from all over the United States to settle in Flagler County, and one of the places they get off the train would be right here in DuPont. And of course, there's nothing but junkyards here. As we go by, you see nothing but wrecked cars and junk and old debris and so forth. But you're right now at the center of DuPont, which was, as I say, was a very successful railway center, and it connected to Henry Flagler. Now, Henry made a deal with the Florida State Legislature that he could claim contiguous land to any of his rail tracks. This made Henry Flagler one of the largest landowners in the state of Florida. He had a lot of land that he owned because he could claim land on either side of his railroad tracks. Now, back 100 years ago, remember we said that the Bunnell Home Builder magazine came out in different languages. Well, one of the languages was Polish. So there was a bunch of Polish settlers that came here from different locations. They pooled their money together and they bought land from the land company. Today it's called Corona, the Crown. And this actually became sort of a religious center. And we're going to see quite a bit of it. But we're headed for Corona right now. And we've just gone past the big rail center of DuPont. I warned you when we started, so much of this stuff doesn't exist anymore. I can tell you about what it was here if you sort of close your eyes and use your imagination and maybe put on a funny hat. you can go back in time. You can. Because there were people living here. There were African American families. There were Caucasian families. And for the most part, they got along very well. And I'm not going to go too deeply in that, but we're going to talk about slavery on the plantations in a moment, because I do know a great deal about this. Okay, so we're headed for Corona right now, and Corona was a Polish settlement, and the first thing they did was to build a church. And keep in mind, there were no hardware stores. There were some mills that were cutting lumber, but these were basically, carpenter was on his own. If he wanted to build a structure, he pretty much had to cut the wood, get the ironwork, and so forth. I mean, it just wasn't an easy thing. Now, we're going to turn down a road that's called the Old Dixie Highway. And I know that's confusing as heck, but the Dixie Highway runs all over the place. And keep in mind, it was fundamentally a line on a map indicated to bring in tourists. So we're on the Old Dixie Highway right now, headed east. And we're in the area of Corona. And again, this was a town. Now, they found out that the land they bought wasn't that great. And they couldn't raise the stuff they were promised. So they went into chicken farming. So the early settlers became very good chicken raisers. And now we're turning down this little dirt road. Now, this is the original Corona church, built by Polish carpenters over 100 years ago. It is in mint condition inside. It's exactly the way it was 100 years ago. And it's maintained as a museum by the church. If you want to see it, come here on a Sunday. There is always someone dying to show you the inside. Park here, go inside. It's exactly the way it was 100 years ago inside, and it's gorgeous. They had built recently a little shop here. They sell memorabilia and books and so forth. St. Mary's Thrift Shop. These are all volunteers. So if you want to see this church, and I recommend it highly. It's here the way it was 100 years ago. You go inside and it looks just the way it was. I mean, it's authentic as you can get. And of course, there's always all volunteers here that are just dying to tell you about it and show it to you. So this is called St. Mary's, okay?